The morning sun painted the Arizona mountains gold as Maria Santos swept dust from her family's trading post porch. The year was 1886, and their small store sat like a lonely island between two worlds. On one side stretched the Apache reservation, where smoke from morning cooking fires drifted up from scattered camps. On the other side lay the growing settlements of miners and ranchers. Hungry for land and quick fortunes, Maria had grown up in this in-between place. Her father, Diego Santos, had built the trading post 15 years ago when tensions ran high and trust came hard. But Diego believed in fairness. He traded honest goods for honest payment, whether his customers spoke Spanish, English, or Apache. Over the years he had earned respect from all sides. The peace had lasted 8 months now. No raids, no killings, no soldiers chasing shadows through the desert. The Apache leaders and the government had signed papers promising to respect boundaries and live side by side. Maria's younger brother Carlos often joked that their trading post had become the center of the universe, where everyone came to buy supplies and share news, but Maria felt something wrong in the air that morning. Maybe it was the way the Apache. Women who usually came early to trade for coffee and flour had stayed away for 3 days. Or maybe it was the strange stories drifting in from other trading posts about missing Apache families and burned camps that no one could explain. She watched her father arrange bolts of colorful cloth on the counter inside. Diego had taught her that people were people no matter what language they spoke or what color their skin was. The Apache mothers wanted pretty fabric for their daughters just like anyone else. The miners needed good boots and strong rope. The ranchers required quality, leather and reliable tools. "Papa," Maria called from the doorway, "old Vicente from the reservation hasn't been by this week. He always comes for tobacco on Wednesdays." Diego looked up, worry creasing his weathered face. Vicente was an Apache elder who had become something like a friend over the years. He spoke excellent Spanish and often brought news from the reservation. His absence meant something. "Maybe his arthritis is bothering him again," Diego said, but his voice carried doubt. Maria shook her head. "Mrs. Gonzalez from the settlement stopped by yesterday. She said her husband saw smoke from the direction of Vicente's camp 2 nights ago. More smoke than usual." Before Diego could respond, the sound of horses approached from the east. Maria stepped outside and saw a sight that made her stomach tighten. A column of cavalry soldiers rode toward their trading post, their blue uniforms, dark with sweat and dust. But these weren't the regular army patrol that usually passed through once a month with friendly waves and requests for cold water. The man leading them sat his horse like he owned the world. Captain Jeremiah Blackwood had pale eyes that seemed to look right through people, and a thin mustache that made his mouth look like a knife cut. He had arrived in the territory 6 months ago with orders to keep the peace, but the Apache called him Stoneheart because nothing seemed to move him except his own anger. "Good morning, Captain," Diego called out, stepping onto the porch beside Maria. "What brings you this way?" Blackwood dismounted and walked toward them with slow, deliberate steps. His men remained on their horses, hands resting near their weapons. Maria noticed their uniforms looked different somehow, less official. Some wore pieces of civilian clothes mixed with their military gear. "Santos," Blackwood said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We're tracking Apache raiders. They hit a settlement north of here 2 days ago. Killed a family and burned their homestead." Maria felt cold despite the warm morning air. She had heard no such news, and word traveled fast in the territory. "Which family?" Diego asked. "We haven't heard anything about trouble." "The Hendersons," Blackwood replied quickly. "New settlers, you wouldn't know them." Something in his tone made Maria suspicious. She had met most of the new families in the area through the trading post. There were no Hendersons that she knew of. "Have you found any trace of these raiders?" Diego asked carefully, Blackwood's cold eyes fixed on him. "We have reason to believe they're hiding somewhere near the reservation boundary. Someone might be helping them, giving them supplies, information, safe places to rest." The threat in his words hung in the air like smoke. Maria realized he was suggesting that her family might be helping Apache raiders. The accusation was ridiculous, but also dangerous. In these times, suspicion could be as deadly as bullets. "Captain, you know our family has always supported peace," Diego said firmly. "We trade honestly with everyone. We follow all territorial laws, Blackwood repeated, as if the word tasted bitter. Laws written by politicians back east who have never seen what these savages can do. Laws that protect killers and punish honest citizens trying to build something good in this wilderness." Maria watched the captain's men while he spoke. They looked rough, meaner than regular soldiers. One of them had dried blood on his sleeve. Another wore Apache jewelry around his neck, the kind that women made for their children. A sick feeling grew in her stomach. "We need supplies," Blackwood continued. "Food, ammunition, rope. The government will pay you back eventually." Diego hesitated. "Of course, Captain. Though I should mention our inventory is getting low. The supply wagon from Tucson is late this month." "Give us what you have," Blackwood ordered. "And Santos, keep your eyes open. If you see any Apache who don't belong on the reservation, you report it immediately. Same goes for anyone who might be helping them." As Diego and Carlos gathered supplies for the soldiers, Maria stayed on the porch, pretending to sweep while listening to the men talk among themselves. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Should have finished them all last night," one soldier muttered to another. "Captain says we need to be patient, make it look right for the reports. Bunch of cowards running into the rocks like that. But we got enough of them. Those kids won't last long where we put them." Maria's hands trembled on the broom handle. Were they talking about Apache children? She wanted to hear more, but Blackwood was watching her with those pale, calculating eyes. When the soldiers finally rode away, Maria felt like she could breathe again. But the feeling of wrongness remained, stronger than before. That evening, she convinced Carlos to ride with her to check on old Vicente's camp under the pretense of looking for stray cattle. What they found changed everything. Vicente's camp was gone. Not abandoned. Destroyed. The traditional Apache shelter had been burned, along with personal belongings scattered and trampled into the dirt. Dark stains on the rocks told a story that made Maria sick to her stomach. But there were no bodies, which somehow made it worse. What had happened to Vicente and his small family? Carlos found tracks leading away from the camp. Boot prints, not moccasins. Shod horses, not unshod ponies. White men had done this, not Apache raiders. As they rode home in the growing darkness, Maria realized that the peace everyone believed in was a lie. Someone was murdering Apache families and making it look like Indian raids. And she was beginning to understand who that someone might be. The next morning would bring even worse discoveries. But that night, Maria lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering if her family was safe. Outside her window, the desert held its secrets close, but she had already seen too much. The broken piece was about to shatter completely, and she was standing right in the middle of where the pieces would fall. Maria woke before dawn 3 days later, her mind still heavy with worry about Vicente's destroyed camp. She had told her father what they found, but Diego urged caution. "We don't know what really happened," he said. "Maybe Vicente moved his family to safety. Maybe there's an explanation we don't understand." But Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was building in the desert around them. She dressed quietly and slipped outside to milk their cow before the heat of the day began. The morning air felt different, charged with tension. Like the moments before a thunderstorm. As she carried the milk bucket back toward the house, she heard horses approaching from the north. Too early for customers? Too many horses for a normal patrol? Maria quickly ducked behind the wooden storage shed and peered around the corner. Captain Blackwood rode at the head of his column again, but this time his men looked different. Their faces were painted with dark streaks, and they wore pieces of Apache clothing mixed with their cavalry gear. Feathers hung from their hair, and several carried traditional Apache weapons alongside their military rifles. Maria's blood went cold. She had heard stories of false flag operations, where soldiers disguised themselves as Indians to justify attacks on peaceful tribes. But seeing it happen made her stomach turn to stone. The soldiers rode past the trading post without stopping, heading toward the hills where several Apache families maintained small camps outside the main reservation. Maria knew those families. They were peaceful people who often traded at her father's store. The children played with carved wooden toys while their mothers examined fabric in their fathers, discussed weather and crops. Without thinking clearly, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She saddled their fastest horse, a paint mare named Luna, and followed the soldiers at a distance. She told herself she just wanted to see where they were going, maybe warn the Apache families if she could do it safely. The soldiers moved with purpose through the rocky terrain, clearly knowing exactly where they were headed. Maria stayed far back, using the cover of boulders and scrub brush to remain hidden. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she was tracking armed men who wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who got in their way. After an hour of careful following, the soldiers stopped at a small canyon where 3 Apache families had set up temporary camps near a reliable water source. Maria dismounted and crept closer on foot, finding a hiding spot behind a large rock formation, where she could see down into the canyon. What happened next would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Blackwood's men surrounded the camps while the Apache families were still sleeping. There was no warning, no chance to surrender or explain. The attack began with gunfire and shouts in broken Apache language, designed to sound like a rival tribe seeking revenge, but Maria could see the truth. She watched Blackwood himself shoot an unarmed Apache grandfather who raised his hands in peace. She saw soldiers grab crying children and tie their hands before loading them into a covered wagon that had been hidden nearby. She witnessed the systematic destruction of everything the families owned, their belongings scattered and burned to make it look like the aftermath of a raid. The worst part was the cold efficiency of it all. This wasn't a battle or even a massacre driven by fear and anger. It was a calculated performance, designed to create evidence of Apache aggression that didn't really exist. Maria pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out as she watched families torn apart. The soldiers took anything valuable, including horses and silver jewelry, but left enough destruction to support their false story. Several Apache women and children were loaded into the wagon, disappearing under heavy canvas covers. Maria counted at least 8 people who simply vanished. When it was over, Blackwood gathered his men and gave orders she could barely hear. Something about reporting an Apache raid on peaceful settlers, about the need to respond with force to protect innocent families. The lies came easily to him, as if he had told them many times before. As the soldiers prepared to leave, Maria realized she needed to get back to the trading post before they did. If Blackwood discovered she had witnessed his crimes, her whole family would be in danger. She crept back to Luna and began the long ride home, her mind spinning with horror and disbelief. But she wasn't careful enough. One of Blackwood's scouts, a thin man with cruel eyes named Patterson, had been watching the surrounding hills for any signs of witnesses. He spotted movement among the rocks and followed Maria's trail back toward the trading post. By the time she reached home, Patterson had seen enough to know that someone had been watching their operation. Maria burst through the front door of the trading post, startling her father, who was arranging supplies on the shelves. "Papa, we have to leave," she gasped, still breathing hard from the desperate ride. "Right now, today." Diego looked at his daughter's pale face and wild eyes. "Maria, what happened? Where have you been?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. Through the window, they could see Blackwood's column returning, but now the soldiers looked like themselves again. They had washed off the war paint and removed the Apache disguises, transforming back into representatives of the United States Army. "They're coming," Maria whispered, grabbing her father's arm. "Papa, they killed those families." "They took children. They made it look like Apache raiders, but it was them. It was always them." Diego's face went white as he understood what his daughter was telling him. Before he could respond, Blackwood kicked open the front door without knocking. His pale eyes swept the room, taking in Maria's disheveled appearance and frightened expression. "Santos," Blackwood said slowly, "I'm afraid I have terrible news. Apache raiders attacked 3 families this morning." Peaceful people, murdered in their sleep. We managed to track the savages back toward the reservation, but they escaped into the rocks. Maria felt sick listening to the lies. She wanted to scream the truth, but she could see the threat in Blackwood's eyes. He knew that she knew. That's terrible, Diego managed to say. Were there any survivors? Some children were taken, Blackwood replied, never taking his eyes off Maria. Probably slaves now if they're still alive. This is what happens when people get soft on the Indian problem. When they start thinking savages can be trusted. The captain stepped closer to Maria, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I hope everyone in this territory understands that neutrality isn't an option anymore. People are either with civilization or against it. There's no middle ground when dealing with murderers. Maria forced herself to meet his gaze, even though every instinct told her to run. Of course, Captain. We want peace as much as anyone. Peace. Blackwood repeated, the word sounding like a curse. Peace comes through strength, not through trading with the enemy. After the soldiers left, Maria and her father stood in shocked silence. They both understood that their world had changed forever. The trading post that had been a symbol of cooperation between different peoples was now a dangerous place to be. Blackwood clearly suspected that Maria had seen something she shouldn't have. That night, as Maria lay in bed listening for any sound that might signal danger, she realized that tomorrow would bring a choice. She could stay silent and hope Blackwood forgot about his suspicions, or she could find a way to expose the truth about what was really happening in the Arizona territory. Either choice might get her family killed. But staying silent meant more. Innocent people would die, and their deaths would be blamed on people who were already fighting just to survive. Outside her window, the desert night was full of shadows and secrets. Somewhere out there, Apache children were prisoners of the very soldiers who were supposed to protect them. And somewhere else, Blackwood was probably planning his next false flag operation. Maria closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but she knew that rest wouldn't come easily anymore. She had seen evil wearing the uniform of justice, and that knowledge would change everything about how she looked at the world around her. Sleep never came for Maria that night. Every sound outside made her jump, the wind rattling the shutters, a coyote calling in the distance, even the settling of the wooden beams in their house. She kept seeing those Apache children being loaded into Blackwood's wagon. Their terrified faces burned into her memory like brands. When dawn finally broke, Maria found her father already up, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Carlos was nowhere to be seen, probably out tending to their animals like he did every morning. The normal routine of their lives continued, but everything felt different now. We have to tell someone, Maria said quietly, sitting across from Diego. There must be honest soldiers somewhere, or a territorial judge who would listen. Diego looked up with tired eyes. Who would believe us? A Mexican family accusing a United States Army captain of murder? And even if they believed us, what proof do we have? Your word against his? Maria knew he was right, but the weight of staying silent felt impossible to bear. So we just let him keep killing innocent people? We stay alive, Diego said firmly. Dead witnesses can't help anyone. But even as he spoke, they both heard the sound that had been haunting Maria's nightmares. Horses approaching. Multiple riders. Moving fast toward their trading post, Maria ran to the window and felt her heart stop. Blackwood was back, but this time he had twice as many men with him. They surrounded the trading post like wolves surrounding prey, their weapons clearly visible. Santos. Blackwood's voice boomed across the morning air. Come out here, we need to talk. Diego squeezed Maria's shoulder. Stay inside, he whispered. Let me handle this. But as her father stepped onto the porch, Maria could see the cold determination in Blackwood's pale eyes. This wasn't going to be another conversation. This was something final. Captain, Diego called out, trying to keep his voice steady. What can we do for you this morning? You can start by telling me where your daughter went yesterday, Blackwood replied, dismounting slowly. My scout saw horse tracks leading from the canyon where those Apache savages were hiding. Fresh tracks from a paint horse heading straight. Back here, Maria's blood turned to ice. They had followed her trail. Her attempt to stay hidden had failed completely. My daughter doesn't leave the trading post without permission, Diego said carefully. She was here all day yesterday, helping with inventory. Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You're lying, Santos. Just like you've been lying about your loyalties. We know you've been trading information to the Apache, telling them when supply wagons are coming, warning them about patrols. That's not true, Diego protested. We've always followed territorial law. Territorial law, Blackwood spat. Written by weak men who don't understand what it takes to bring civilization to this wilderness. But that's about to change. Maria watched in horror as Blackwood gestured to his men. They began spreading out, clearly preparing for something terrible. She realized with growing panic that they weren't planning to arrest her family. They were planning to eliminate the only witnesses to their crimes. Papa, she called out, unable to stay silent any longer. Get back inside, but it was too late. Blackwood's men were already moving, and Diego was too far from the door. Maria grabbed her father's hunting rifle from its place above the fireplace and ran outside, even though she knew it was hopeless. One rifle against 15 armed soldiers was suicide, but she couldn't let them hurt her father without trying to help. There she is, Blackwood said with satisfaction. The little spy who thinks she can play games with the United States Army. Maria raised the rifle with shaking hands. Stay away from us. We haven't done anything wrong. You've seen things you shouldn't have seen, Blackwood replied. That makes you dangerous, and dangerous people don't get to live in my territory. The soldiers raised their weapons, and Maria knew her family was about to die. She closed her eyes and tried to find courage for their final moments. But instead of gunfire, she heard something else entirely, a sound like nothing she had ever experienced before, a battle cry that seemed to come from the desert itself, wild and fierce and full of ancient power. When she opened her eyes, she saw a figure moving with impossible speed through the rocks above the trading post. The Apache warrior appeared like a ghost materialized from smoke. One moment the hillside was empty, and the next moment he was there, moving through Blackwoods. Men like death itself. Maria had heard stories about Apache fighting skills, but seeing it happen was like watching something from legend come to life. The warrior moved with fluid grace, using the rocky terrain and his knowledge of desert warfare to turn 15-1 odds into something manageable. He wasn't trying to kill everyone. Maria realized he was trying to create chaos, to break up their formation and give her family a chance to escape. But even as she watched this incredible display of skill and courage, Maria wondered why. Why would an Apache warrior risk his life to save a Mexican family he didn't even know? The answer came when the warrior called out in Spanish, "Get inside the house, stay low." It was Nalish Vichente's nephew. Maria recognized his voice now, though she had only met him a few times at the trading post. He was the Apache scout who sometimes came with Vicente to trade for supplies, a quiet man who spoke 3 languages and seemed to see everything while saying very little. Blackwood's men were shouting and firing wildly, but they were used to fighting in formation against clearly visible enemies. This style of warfare, individual combat in rough terrain against an opponent who seemed to vanish and reappear at will, was completely outside their experience. "Kill him!" Blackwood screamed. "Kill the savage!" But Nalnish was already gone, melted back into the rocks, as if he had never been there. The sudden silence that followed was more frightening than the gunfire had been. "Spread out," Blackwood ordered his men. "Find him. He can't have gone far." Maria watched from her window as the soldiers began searching the hills around their trading post. But she could see something they couldn't. Nalnish was still there, moving like a shadow between the boulders, always staying just out of sight. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the Apache warrior was playing a careful game. He would appear just long enough to draw the soldiers in one direction, then vanish before they could get close. Each time they thought they had him cornered, he was somewhere else entirely. Blackwood was growing more frustrated by the hour. His Men were tired, confused, and starting to make mistakes. Maria realized that Nalnish was deliberately wearing them down, using their own anger and impatience against them. As evening approached, Blackwood made a decision that revealed just how desperate he had become. "Set fire to the trading post," he ordered his men. "Burn them out. If we can't catch the Apache, we'll make sure his friends don't survive to tell tales." Maria felt her world crashing down as she watched soldiers prepare torches. Everything her family had built, all the relationships they had carefully nurtured between different communities, was about to turn to ash, but before the first torch could be lit, Nalnish appeared one more time. This time he didn't vanish immediately. Instead, he stood on a high rock where everyone could see him clearly, his rifle pointed directly at Blackwood. "Let them go," Nalnish called out in clear English. "Your fight is with me, not with peaceful people." Blackwood raised his own weapon. "My fight is with every savage in this territory. Starting with you." What happened next would change all their lives forever. But in that moment, as Maria watched an Apache warrior stand alone against overwhelming odds to protect her family, she understood something important about courage and honor. Sometimes the people who looked like enemies were actually the only ones willing to do what was right. The desert wind carried the scent of coming rain, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like war drums calling brave souls to battle. The standoff on the rocky hillside lasted only seconds, but to Maria it felt like hours. Nalnish stood perfectly still, his rifle aimed at Blackwood's heart, while 15 soldiers pointed their weapons back at him. The desert evening held its breath, waiting for someone to make the first move. Then everything happened at once. A shot rang out, but not from where anyone expected. Carlos, who had been hiding in the barn since the soldiers arrived, fired their father's old shotgun into the air. The sudden boom from an unexpected direction sent Blackwood's men diving for cover, thinking they were under attack from multiple sides. In that moment of confusion, Nalnish moved. He didn't shoot anyone. Instead, he leaped down from his perch and disappeared into the maze of boulders below. But this time, instead of running away, he was running toward the trading post. "Maria," he called out in Spanish, "bring water and food." "We leave now." Maria looked at her father, who nodded grimly. They both understood that staying here meant death, either from Blackwood's bullets or his lies about Apache raids. Diego quickly grabbed a bag and started stuffing it with dried meat, hardtack, and ammunition. "Carlos!" Maria shouted toward the barn. "Come on!" Her younger brother appeared in the doorway, clutching the empty shotgun. His face was pale but determined. At 15, Carlos was already taller than his father, but he still looked like a scared boy trying to be brave. Blackwood's voice roared across the compound. "Surround the house! Don't let any of them escape." But the soldiers were still confused and scattered from Carlos's surprise shot. Some were taking cover behind rocks. Others were trying to regroup near their horses. In the growing darkness, they couldn't tell where the next attack might come from. Nalnish appeared at the back door of the trading post like a ghost materializing from shadows. Up close, Maria could see he was younger than she had thought, maybe 25 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had survived many dangerous situations. "Why are you helping us?" Diego asked in Spanish, even as he shouldered the supply bag. "Because your family treated my people with respect," Nalnish replied simply. "And because I saw what those soldiers did to my uncle Vicente and his family." Maria's heart sank. "Vicente is dead?" 3 days ago, along with his wife and daughter. They made it look like a settler attack, then blamed us for raiding in revenge. Nalnish's voice was calm, but Maria could hear the pain underneath. "I have been tracking these false soldiers ever since." "False soldiers?" Carlos asked, not understanding. "They wear army uniforms, but they follow no army orders," Nalnish explained as he led them toward the back of the building. "They work for mining companies and land speculators who want to start a new war. Kill Apache, learn Apache, take Apache land." Outside, they could hear Blackwood shouting orders to his men. "Check every room, search every building. They can't have gone Far. Nalnish motioned for them to stay low as they crept toward a dry creek bed that ran behind the trading post. I watched them for weeks, he whispered. They have done this to 7 Apache families. Always the same pattern: attack at dawn, take children for slaves, burn everything, then report Apache raids to justify more attacks. Diego shook his head in disgust. How can they get away with such evil? Because people want to believe Apache are dangerous, Nalnish said simply. It makes stealing our land easier to accept. They reached the creek bed just as torches began to flicker inside the trading post. Blackwood had made good on his threat to burn them out. Maria watched 15 years of her family's work go up in flames and felt tears burning her eyes. Sorry, Nalnish said quietly, seeing her expression. Your father built something good here, a place where different people could meet in peace. It's not your fault, Maria replied, surprised by the Apache warrior's gentleness. She had expected him to be harder, more distant. You risked your life to save us? Why? Nalnish was quiet for a moment as they moved through the darkness, following the creek bed away from the burning building. Finally, he said, My grandmother taught me that there are 2 kinds of people in the world. Those who build bridges and those who burn them. Your family built bridges. They walked for hours through the desert night, staying in washes and low places where they wouldn't be silhouetted against the sky. Nalnish moved like he was part of the landscape itself, finding paths where Maria saw only rocks and thorns. Where are we going? Carlos asked when they stopped to rest near a small spring. Somewhere safe where we can plan, Nalnish replied. But first, we need to understand what we are really fighting. Over the next 3 days, hidden in a cave system that Nalnish's people had used for generations, the unlikely group began to piece together the full scope of Blackwood's operation. Maria shared what she had witnessed at the Canyon Massacre. Nalnish described the other attacks he had investigated. Diego contributed his knowledge of territorial politics and land deals. The picture that emerged was worse than any of them had imagined. It's not just random violence, Maria realized as they talked by a small fire deep in the cave. They're targeting specific families, specific areas, Nalnish nodded grimly. All near water sources or mineral deposits. Places where mining companies want to dig or ranchers want to graze cattle. Diego spread out a rough map he had drawn on a piece of bark. Look at this pattern. Every attack happened near land that was recently surveyed by the Territorial Development Company. What's that? Carlos asked. A group of businessmen from back east, Diego explained. They've been buying up land rights all over the territory. But they can't touch reservation land unless there's a war that justifies taking it for public safety. Maria felt sick as the full plan became clear. So they create the war themselves? Make it look like Apache are attacking innocent families, then use that as an excuse to seize more land. And make a fortune in the process, Nalnish added bitterly. While my people are blamed for crimes we never committed. That night, as they planned their next move, Maria found herself talking with Nalnish about things she had never discussed with anyone before. He spoke 3 languages fluently and had attended a mission school as a child, learning to read and write better than many white settlers. But he had chosen to return to his people when he realized the school was trying to erase everything Apache about him. They wanted to kill the Indian in me to save the man, he explained. But I am Apache. That is not something to be killed or saved from. It is something to be proud of, Maria understood. Her own family had faced similar pressure to abandon their Mexican heritage and become real Americans. But Diego had always insisted they could be both Mexican and American. That belonging to one group didn't mean rejecting the other. My father says the same thing, she told Nalnish. He says America is supposed to be big enough for everyone. Your father is a wise man, Nalnish replied. That is why Blackwood wanted to destroy him. Wise people are dangerous to those who profit from fear and hatred. On the 4th day, they made a decision that would change everything. Rather than running farther into the desert or trying to disappear completely, they would fight back. But not with bullets and violence, with truth. We need proof, Maria said. Something that even Blackwood's friends can't ignore or explain away. The children, Nalnish said suddenly. The Apache children they took? If we can find them and free them, we have living witnesses to their crimes. Diego looked worried. That's incredibly dangerous. If we're caught, if we do nothing, more families die, Maria replied firmly. And those children remain slaves forever. Carlos, who had been quiet during most of their planning, finally spoke up. I want to help. Those soldiers burned our home. They would have killed us. We can't just let them keep hurting people. Nalnish studied the young man's face carefully. This is not a game, Carlos. If we do this, there is no going back. We become outlaws in the eyes of the territorial government. We're already outlaws, Maria pointed out. Blackwood will never stop hunting us. Our only chance is to expose the truth before he kills everyone who knows it. That night, as they prepared for the most dangerous mission of their lives, Maria realized that something extraordinary had happened in this cave. 4 people from completely different worlds had become a family united by their commitment to justice. A Mexican trader, his children, and an Apache warrior had found common ground in their shared humanity. Tomorrow, they would begin the fight to save innocent children and expose a conspiracy that reached from desert camps to boardrooms back east. Tonight, they were just 4 people around a small fire, sharing stories and building the trust they would need to survive what was coming. The desert wind howled outside their cave, but inside, they had found something worth fighting for. The rescue mission began before dawn on their 5th day in hiding. Nalnish had spent the previous evening scouting Blackwood's main camp, a temporary fort built around an abandoned mining claim about 20 miles north of where the trading post had stood. He returned with disturbing news. They have at least 30 men now, he reported to the others as they huddled around their small fire, and they are building something permanent. Wooden buildings, supply wagons, even a telegraph line to connect, with towns farther east. Diego frowned as he studied Nalnish's rough sketch of the camp layout. That's not a temporary military operation, that's a settlement. Exactly, Nalnish said grimly. They plan to stay. Make this their headquarters for expanding operations across the whole territory, Maria felt her heart sink. What about the children? I saw them, Nalnish replied, his voice heavy with anger. 12 Apache children, ages 6 to 15. They are being kept in a wooden cage near the center of camp, like animals in a zoo? Carlos clenched his fists. How can they treat children that way? Because they don't see them as children, Nalnish explained bitterly, to Blackwood and his men. Apache are not people. We are obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. Maria had been thinking about their impossible situation all night. Even if we free the children, where can we take them? Blackwood controls this whole area now, and who would believe their word against a United States Army captain? There is one man who might listen, Diego said slowly. Federal Marshal William Hayes. He has been investigating reports of irregularities in territorial land deals. If we could reach him with proof... Where is this marshal? Nalnish asked. Fort Bowie. 3 days' ride east. But the problem is getting there alive with a dozen frightened children. They spent hours working out the details of their plan. It would require perfect timing, incredible luck, and more courage than any of them felt they possessed. But as Nalnish pointed out, doing nothing meant watching those children disappear forever into a life of slavery or worse. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. They would wait for the supply wagon that came to Blackwood's camp every few days, then create a diversion that would draw most of the guards away from the children's prison. In the confusion, they would free the captives and escape into the desert before anyone realized what had happened. What kind of diversion? Carlos asked. Nalnish smiled grimly. The kind that makes Blackwood think he is under attack by a large Apache war party. 2 days later, they put their plan into action. The supply wagon arrived at Blackwood's camp just after noon, as Nalnish had predicted. Maria and her family took positions in the rocks above the camp, while Nalnish disappeared into the maze of boulders and thorny brush that surrounded the settlement. From her hiding place, Maria could see the wooden cage where the Apache children were being held. Even from a distance, she could see how thin and scared they looked. Some were barely older than Carlos had been when their mother died. The sight filled her with cold determination. The first part of Nalnish's diversion began with smoke signals, rising from 3 different hills around the camp. To Blackwood's men, it would look like Apache scouts communicating about an impending attack. Within minutes, soldiers were scrambling to defensive positions, calling out warnings about war parties. In the hills, then came the arrows. Not aimed to kill, but designed to create maximum panic. Flaming arrows landed in haystacks and supply tents, starting small fires that sent men running with buckets of water. Regular arrows whistled past sentries' heads, close enough to be frightening. But carefully aimed to miss, Blackwood's voice roared across the camp. "Apache attack! All men to positions! Protect the supplies." This was exactly what they had hoped for. Most of the guards abandoned their posts to fight fires or search for attackers who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The wooden cage holding the children was left with only 2 guards. Just as Nalnish had predicted, Maria watched as her Apache friend materialized behind the first guard like a shadow come to life. The man went down silently, never knowing what hit him. The second guard turned at the sound, but Diego was already there, having crept down from the rocks while everyone's attention was focused on the fires and arrows. "We're here to help," Maria whispered in Spanish as she reached the cage, hoping at least some of the children would understand. "We're going to get you out of here." The oldest boy, maybe 14 years old, stared at her with suspicious eyes. "Why would Mexicans help Apache?" he asked in careful Spanish. "Because it's the right thing to do," Maria replied simply, working to break the lock on the cage door. "And because we have a friend who sent us." When Nalnish appeared beside the cage, several of the children called out his name with relief and hope. Maria realized that some of them must be relatives or friends of his from the reservation. The trust in their eyes when they saw him made her throat tight with emotion. Getting 12 children out of a military camp without being noticed was harder than they had imagined. The youngest ones were too weak from poor treatment to move quickly. Others were too scared to trust that this rescue was real. But Nalnish spoke to them in Apache, explaining who Maria's family was and why they were helping. The escape almost went perfectly. They had reached the edge of camp and were heading toward the rocky hills where they could disappear when disaster struck. One of the youngest children, a girl maybe 7 years old, tripped and cried out in pain. Her voice carried across the camp just as Blackwood's men were finally getting the fires under control. Within seconds, shouts of "The prisoners are escaping" filled the air. "Run!" Nalnish shouted, scooping up the injured girl and sprinting toward the rocks. "Don't look back." Maria helped 2 other small children while Carlos and Diego each took responsibility for the older ones who could move on their own. Behind them they could hear Blackwood screaming orders and the thunder of horses as mounted soldiers began pursuit. The next hour was the longest of Maria's life. They scrambled through rocky terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and tear skin, always hearing the sound of pursuit getting closer. The children were exhausted and terrified, but they kept moving because they understood that capture meant something worse than death. Nalnish proved to be a master of desert warfare. He led them through hidden paths and secret water sources that only the Apache knew about. When the soldiers got too close, he would double back and create another diversion, using the rocks and thorny brush to make a few people sound like many, but even Nalnish couldn't perform miracles. As evening approached, they realized that Blackwood had called in help from other outposts. There were now dozens of mounted soldiers hunting them, along with tracker dogs and Apache scouts who had been forced to work for the army. "We can't outrun them with the children," Diego said during a brief rest stop. "They're too tired and we're leaving too clear a trail." "I know a place," Nalnish said quietly. "A sacred cave system where my people have hidden during times of trouble. But getting there means crossing open ground where we will be visible for miles." Maria looked at the exhausted children, some barely able to walk. "How far?" 2 hours. If we move fast, but they will see us for sure. Then we make sure they're looking somewhere else, Carlos said with determination that surprised everyone. I'll lead some of the soldiers away, create a false trail. Absolutely not, Diego said. Firmly, we stay together. But before anyone could argue further, they heard something that made their blood run cold. Bloodhounds baying in the distance, getting closer. Blackwood had brought tracker dogs. The cave, Nalnish decided. It's our only chance. The dogs can't follow scent through running water. They began the desperate race across open desert just as the sun was setting. For 30 minutes, they were completely exposed, moving as fast as the smallest children could manage across ground that offered no concealment. Maria kept expecting to hear gunshots or the thunder of approaching horses. Instead, they heard something. Worse. Nalnish stopped suddenly and pointed toward the eastern horizon. Riders, he said grimly. Coming from Fort Bowie direction, Maria's heart sank as she realized what this meant. Blackwood had sent word ahead. Now they were trapped between two groups of soldiers, with a dozen exhausted children and nowhere left to run. The sacred cave was still half a mile away across open ground. Behind them, the bloodhounds were getting closer. Ahead of them, fresh soldiers were riding hard to cut off their escape route. As the last light faded from the desert sky, Maria realized they had walked into a trap. Somewhere in the darkness, Captain Blackwood was probably smiling, knowing that his problems were about to be solved permanently, but she had underestimated both Nalnish's resourcefulness and the determination of children who had already survived. More than most adults ever would. The real fight was just beginning. As the riders from Fort Bowie drew closer, Maria squinted through the desert twilight and felt a spark of hope. The lead horseman wore the uniform of a federal marshal, not a cavalry officer. His badge caught the last rays of sunlight as he raised his hand to signal his men to slow down. "That's Marshal Hayes," Diego whispered, recognizing the lawman from previous visits to the territory. "Maybe we have a chance after all." But Nalnish remained tense, his hand resting on his rifle. "Careful," he warned. "Blackwood has fooled government officials before. We don't know who this marshal really serves." The federal marshal approached with 5 men, all wearing proper federal badges rather than territorial cavalry uniforms. William Hayes was a tall man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had been investigating irregularities in territorial land deals for months, growing more suspicious with each report of Apache raids followed immediately by land seizures. "You folks look like you're in trouble," Marshal Hayes called out, keeping his distance but showing no immediate hostility. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching bloodhounds and cavalry filled the night air. Blackwood's pursuit force was getting closer, and Maria realized they were about to witness a confrontation between federal and territorial authority. "Marshal Hayes?" Diego stepped forward carefully. "I'm Diego Santos. I used to run the trading post near the Apache reservation. These children are Apache prisoners who were being held illegally by Captain Blackwood." Hayes studied the group of exhausted children with growing concern. "Prisoners? Under what authority?" "No authority," Nalnish said grimly, speaking in clear English. "They were taken during attacks on peaceful Apache families." Attacks that Blackwood's men carried out while disguised as Apache raiders. The marshal's eyes sharpened. "That's a serious accusation." "Do you have proof?" Maria stepped forward, her heart pounding. This was the moment of truth. "I witnessed one of the attacks myself. I saw Blackwood soldiers dressed like Apache warriors and attack families who were sleeping peacefully. They took children and killed elders, then reported it as an Apache raid on white settlers." "She's lying." Blackwood's voice boomed across the desert as his cavalry force appeared from the rocks behind them. "These people are Apache sympathizers. They helped raiders escape after attacking innocent families." Captain Blackwood rode forward with 20 armed men, his pale eyes fixed on Maria with obvious hatred. But Marshal Hayes held up his hand, stopping the cavalry charge before it could begin. "Hold your positions, Captain," Hayes ordered firmly. "I'm conducting a federal investigation here." "Investigation?" Blackwood's voice dripped with contempt. "Marshal, these are known Apache collaborators. The woman there witnessed our legitimate military action against hostiles and is now spreading lies to protect her savage friends. Then you won't mind explaining why these Apache children are so far from the reservation? Hayes replied coolly. And why they appear to have been mistreated. Maria watched the two men face each other and realized she was seeing something important. Marshal Hayes represented federal authority and constitutional law. Blackwood represented something else. Entirely a twisted version of frontier justice that served private interests rather than public good. Those children were rescued from Apache raiders, Blackwood said without hesitation. We're returning them to the reservation for their own safety. In wooden cages? Hayes asked, having noticed the rope marks on the children's wrists. Temporary restraints to prevent them from running back to their captors, Blackwood replied. Smoothly. Standard procedure when dealing with traumatized children who don't understand they're being helped. Maria felt sick listening to Blackwood's lies. But she also noticed something else. Several of Blackwood's men looked uncomfortable with their captain's explanations. These weren't all hardened criminals. Some were regular soldiers who had been told they were fighting Apache raiders, not murdering innocent families. Marshal, she called out, ask Captain Blackwood about the Territorial Development Company. Ask him about the mining surveys that just happened to occur near every place where these supposed Apache raids took place. Hayes turned his sharp gaze on Blackwood. What mining surveys? For the first time, Blackwood hesitated. I don't know what she's talking about. My concern is military security, not commercial development. But Marshal Hayes had been investigating territorial corruption for months. He knew exactly what mining surveys Maria was referring to, and he knew they were connected to some very powerful people back east. Captain, I think we need to have a longer conversation about your recent operations, Hayes said carefully, along with documentation of your reports and evidence from the alleged raid sites. My reports are filed with Territorial Command. Blackwood replied, but there was tension in his voice now. I don't answer to federal marshals about legitimate military actions against hostiles. You do when those actions involve violations of federal treaties and possible war crimes. Hayes shot back. The standoff continued as more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. One of the Apache children, a boy about 12 years old, stepped forward and spoke in halting English. This man, he pointed at Blackwood, killed my grandmother. I saw his face when they came to our camp. He wore Apache clothes, but I knew he was a white soldier. The child is obviously confused, Blackwood said quickly. Traumatized children often have confused memories. But Hayes was studying the boy's face carefully. What's your name, son? Tommy, the boy replied. Tommy Running Bear. My grandmother was Elena Running Bear. She lived near the spring at Willow Creek. Hayes pulled out a notebook and flipped through several pages. I have a report here about an Apache raid at Willow Creek, according to Captain Blackwood's official documentation. Apache raiders attacked a white settlement there and killed 3 families. No white families lived at Willow Creek, Nalnish said firmly. Only my people, small camps near the water source. Maria watched Marshal Hayes process this information. She could see him comparing official reports with testimony from witnesses, and the contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. Captain Blackwood, Hayes said slowly, I'm going to need you to accompany me back to Fort Bowie for a formal investigation. These allegations are serious enough to warrant federal review. I don't think so, Marshal, Blackwood replied, and his tone had changed completely. The pretense of military courtesy was gone, replaced by something cold and dangerous. You see, you're a long way from Fort Bowie, and accidents happen in the desert. Hayes and his men immediately reached for their weapons, but Blackwood's soldiers already had their rifles trained on the federal officers. Maria realized with growing horror that they were about to witness a direct confrontation between corrupt territorial forces and federal authority. You're making a mistake, Blackwood, Hayes warned. Kill a federal marshal and you'll have the entire United States Army hunting you. Only if anyone survives to report what happened, Blackwood replied with chilling calm. Tragic Apache raid. Federal marshal and his men killed while trying to protect innocent civilians. I'll be the only surviving witness to tell the story. In that moment, Maria understood the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about land grabbing or even war profiteering. Blackwood and his allies were willing to murder federal officers to protect their conspiracy. They had moved beyond corruption into open rebellion against the United States government itself. "You're talking about treason," Hayes said quietly. "I'm talking about progress," Blackwood replied. "This territory needs strong leadership, not weak politicians who worry about savage rights and constitutional technicalities. The Covenant of Progress understands what it takes to build a civilized society." "The Covenant of Progress?" Hayes repeated, and Maria could see recognition in his eyes. "A group of visionary businessmen and military leaders who understand that sometimes the law has to be bent to serve the greater good." Blackwood explained as if he were discussing the weather. "We've been cleaning up the Apache problem while the federal government wasted time with worthless treaties." Maria felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. The Covenant of Progress wasn't just about stealing Apache land. It was about creating an independent power structure in the territory, one that could operate outside federal control and constitutional law. As night fell completely over the desert, she realized they were facing something much larger and more dangerous than a corrupt military officer. They were caught in the middle of a conspiracy that reached from territorial settlements all the way to boardrooms in eastern cities. And now everyone who knew the truth was standing in an isolated patch of desert, surrounded by men with guns who had already committed multiple murders to protect their secrets. The real battle was about to begin. The tense standoff in the desert night was broken by the youngest Apache child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She had been silent since the rescue, too frightened to speak, but now she tugged on Maria's skirt and whispered something in Apache. Nalnish's face went pale as he heard her words. "She says her brother is still missing. A boy named Joseph, about 10 years old. Blackwood's men took him somewhere else 3 days ago." "Where?" Marshal Hayes demanded, keeping his weapon trained on Blackwood's soldiers. "I don't know what she's talking about," Blackwood said coldly. "Children imagine things when they're scared." But one of Blackwood's own men, a young soldier who looked barely older than Carlos, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Captain," he said hesitantly, "isn't that the boy you sent to Devil's Canyon with Sergeant Patterson?" Blackwood's pale eyes fixed on the soldier with murderous intensity. "Shut your mouth, Private." But it was too late. Marshal Hayes had heard enough. "Devil's Canyon? What's at Devil's Canyon, Captain?" Maria had heard of Devil's Canyon. It was a narrow gorge about 10 miles north, surrounded by steep rock walls with only one way in or out. Local people avoided it because the rocks created strange echoes that sounded like voices in the wind. "Nothing," Blackwood replied, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Just empty desert." The young private who had spoken looked increasingly troubled. "But sir, you said we were taking the boy there to—" "I said shut your mouth." Blackwood roared, drawing his sidearm and pointing it at his own soldier. In that moment, Maria saw something that gave her hope. Not all of Blackwood's men were willing participants in his crimes. Some had been lied to, told they were fighting Apache raiders and protecting innocent families. Now they were learning the truth about what they had really been doing. "Private," Marshal Hayes called out, "what's your name?" "Private Danny Morrison, sir," the young soldier replied, looking terrified but determined, "from Kansas. I joined the army to protect people, not to hurt children." "Tell me about Devil's Canyon, Private Morrison." Morrison glanced nervously at Blackwood's gun, then made his choice. "The captain sent a special detail there yesterday with one Apache boy. Said it was a secure location for holding high value prisoners, but sir, that boy was just a kid. He wasn't dangerous." Blackwood's face twisted with rage. "You traitorous little—" He never finished the sentence. Nalnish moved faster than anyone thought possible, disarming the captain before he could pull the trigger. In the confusion that followed, several of Blackwood's soldiers hesitated, unsure whether to shoot federal officers or protect a corrupt captain who had just threatened to murder one of their own men. "Stand down," Marshal Hayes shouted. "All weapons down now." But Blackwood wasn't finished. Even without his gun, he was still dangerous. "You fools!" he snarled at his hesitating soldiers. "Don't you understand what's at stake here? The Covenant of Progress controls more than just this territory. We have allies in Washington, in the territorial government, in every major business from here to San Francisco. You're talking about a conspiracy against the United States government," Hayes said grimly. "I'm talking about the future." Blackwood shot back. "A future where strong men make the hard decisions instead of weak politicians who care more about savage rights than American progress." Maria listened to this exchange with growing understanding. The Covenant of Progress wasn't just about stealing Apache land. It was about creating a shadow government that could operate outside constitutional law, using violence and corruption to build private empires in the Western territories. "The boy at Devil's Canyon," she said suddenly. "He's not just a prisoner. He's bait," Nalnish nodded grimly. "Bait to draw out Apache rescue attempts. Blackwood wants to eliminate the rest of my people who might testify against him." "That's exactly right," Blackwood said with ugly satisfaction. "By now, word has spread about the missing children. Apache warriors will come to Devil's Canyon, thinking they can rescue the boy? And when they do, my men will be waiting with enough firepower to end the Apache problem permanently." Hayes looked horrified. "You're planning a massacre." "I'm planning a solution," Blackwood corrected. "One dead Apache boy will draw 20 Apache warriors into a perfect killing ground. Then we'll have bodies to prove that the Apache are still hostile and dangerous. The territorial government will have no choice but to authorize complete removal or extermination." Maria felt sick as she realized the full scope of Blackwood's trap. He was using a 10-year-old child as bait to justify genocide. "How many men?" "Do you have at Devil's Canyon?" Marshal Hayes demanded. "Enough," Blackwood replied smugly. "Hidden in the rocks with modern weapons and plenty of ammunition. Any Apache who enters that canyon won't leave alive." Private Morrison spoke up again, his voice shaking. "Sir, there are 15 men positioned in the canyon walls. They have 2 Gatling guns and enough rifles for a small war." Blackwood whirled on the young soldier. "You're going to hang for treason, Morrison." "No," Marshal Hayes said firmly. "He's going to testify at your court-martial for war crimes." But even as Hayes spoke, Maria realized they faced an impossible situation. A 10-year-old Apache boy was trapped in Devil's Canyon, probably terrified and alone. Apache warriors were almost certainly already on their way to rescue him, walking straight into Blackwood's ambush. And even if they could reach the canyon in time to warn the rescuers, 15 soldiers with modern weapons held all the advantages in that narrow gorge. "We have to stop this," she said desperately. "How?" Carlos asked. "We can't fight 15 soldiers with Gatling guns." Nalnish had been studying the stars while listening to the conversation. "My cousin Red Cloud will come," he said quietly. "He is Joseph's uncle. When word reaches him that the boy is missing, he will gather warriors and attempt a rescue." "When?" Hayes asked. "Dawn," Nalnish replied with certainty. "Apache prefer to attack at first light. Red Cloud will bring maybe 8 or 10 warriors, thinking they face a small guard detail. They will be slaughtered." Maria felt time running out like sand through her fingers. Dawn was only a few hours away. Even if they rode hard, they might not reach Devil's Canyon in time to prevent the massacre. "There's another way," she said suddenly, a desperate idea forming in her mind. "What if we get there first? What if we warn Blackwood's men that federal marshals are coming to arrest them?" "They'd never believe it," Hayes said. "They would if Blackwood himself told them," Maria replied. Looking at the captured captain, "If he sent word that the operation was compromised and they needed to withdraw immediately," Blackwood laughed harshly. "You think I would help you save Apache warriors? I'd rather die first." "You might get that chance," Nalnish said quietly, his dark eyes fixed on the corrupt officer. "But first, you're going to help us save an innocent child." What followed was a desperate race against time through the dangerous desert night. They divided into 2 groups. Hayes and most of his men would escort the rescued Apache children to safety while Maria, her family, and Nalnish rode toward Devil's Canyon with Blackwood as their prisoner. The plan was simple but risky. They would use Blackwood to call off his ambush, claiming that federal marshals were closing in and the operation needed to be abandoned. If it worked, Red Cloud's rescue party would find an empty canyon instead of a death trap. If it failed, they would all likely die alongside the Apache warriors they were trying to save. As they rode through the darkness toward Devil's Canyon, Maria couldn't help but think about how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had gone from running a peaceful trading post to racing across the desert trying to prevent a massacre. But she also realized that this was who she had always been inside, someone who couldn't stand by while innocent people suffered. "Why are you doing this?" Blackwood asked during one of their brief rest stops. "These Apache aren't your people. You gain nothing by helping them." Maria looked at the man who had tried to murder her family and felt something like pity. "That's the difference between us, Captain. You only help people when you gain something from it. I help people because it's the right thing to do." "Right. And wrong," Blackwood spat. "Children's concepts. The real world runs on power and profit." "Maybe your world does," she replied. "But there's another world where people like my father build trading posts where everyone is welcome." "Where Apache warriors risk their lives to save Mexican families. Where federal marshals stand up to corruption even when it's dangerous." As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they reached the entrance to Devil's Canyon. Somewhere in those narrow rock walls, 15 armed soldiers waited to commit mass murder. And somewhere in the desert behind them, Apache warriors were riding toward what they thought was a rescue mission. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Maria knew that everything they had fought for would be decided in the next few hours. The entrance to Devil's Canyon looked like a crack in the earth itself, barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass side by side. High stone walls rose on both sides, creating shadows even as the morning sun climbed higher. Maria could see why. Blackwood had chosen this place for his ambush. It was a perfect trap with nowhere to run once you were inside. "This is suicide," Carlos whispered as they studied the narrow opening. "If those soldiers don't believe Blackwood's story, we'll be sitting ducks in there." "We don't have a choice," Maria replied, checking her rifle one more time. "Red Cloud and his warriors will be here soon. If we don't stop this ambush, good people are going to die." Nalnish had been studying the canyon walls through an old spyglass he carried. "I can see movement up there," he reported quietly. "At least 6 positions with rifles pointed down at the entrance, and something that looks like it could be a Gatling gun." Diego wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "How do we know Blackwood won't just signal his men to shoot us the moment we appear?" "Because he knows Marshal Hayes is still alive," Maria said, glancing at their prisoner. "If we disappear, Hayes will bring the entire federal army to this territory. Blackwood may be evil, but he's not stupid." Blackwood himself had been unusually quiet during their approach to the canyon. Now he looked up with those pale, calculating eyes. "You really think you can stop what's coming?" he asked mockingly. "Even if you somehow call off this ambush, the Covenant of Progress has operations in 6 territories. We've been planning this for years." "Maybe," Nalnish replied calmly. "But we can stop you from murdering children today. Sometimes that's enough." They had worked out their plan during the long ride through the night. Blackwood would call out to his men, telling them that federal marshals had discovered the operation and they needed to withdraw immediately. Meanwhile, Nalnish would circle around to the back of the canyon to find and rescue the Apache boy who was being used as bait. "Remember," Maria told Blackwood as they prepared to enter the canyon, "your men can see and hear everything. If you try to warn them about us or signal them to attack, you'll be the first one to die." "And if I cooperate?" Blackwood asked. "Then you live to stand trial," Diego answered firmly. "Which is more mercy than you've shown anyone else." The ride into Devil's Canyon was the longest 100 yards of Maria's life. She could feel hidden eyes watching them from the rocks above, could almost sense rifle barrels tracking their movement. Every step their horses took echoed off the stone walls, making it impossible to move quietly. Halfway into the canyon, Blackwood suddenly called out in a loud, clear voice, "Stand down! Operation is compromised." Federal marshals are en route. The response came immediately from multiple positions in the rocks above. Captain, is that really you? It's me, Blackwood shouted back. Withdraw all units immediately. That's a direct order. For a moment, Maria thought their desperate plan might actually work. Then she heard something that made her blood freeze, the distinctive click of a Gatling gun being prepared to fire. Captain, a voice called down from the rocks. We can see you've got prisoners with you. Should we take them out? Maria realized, with growing horror, that even Blackwood's own men could see that something was wrong. The captain was clearly under duress, and his soldiers were trying to rescue him by killing his captors. Negative, Blackwood shouted quickly, understanding the same thing. These are ... witnesses. Need them alive for questioning. But the damage was done. Maria could hear movement in the rocks above as soldiers repositioned themselves for a better shot. Their plan was falling apart, and they were trapped in the bottom of a narrow canyon with multiple weapons pointed down at them. That's when they heard something else. The sound of approaching horses from the canyon entrance. Red Cloud and his Apache warriors had arrived, riding straight into what they thought was a rescue mission, but was actually an elaborate death trap. Oh no, Carlos breathed, looking back toward the canyon mouth, but Nalnish was no longer with them. While everyone's attention had been focused on the hidden soldiers above, the Apache warrior had somehow vanished from his horse and disappeared into the maze of rocks and shadows that filled the canyon floor. The Apache rescue party entered Devil's Canyon just as the first shot rang out from above. But instead of the coordinated ambush that Blackwood had planned, chaos erupted throughout the narrow gorge. Some of the hidden soldiers were firing at Red Cloud's warriors. Others were trying to target Maria's group, and a few seemed confused about who they were supposed to be shooting at. Maria threw herself from her horse and scrambled for cover behind a large boulder, pulling Carlos with her. Diego dove in the opposite direction, dragging the bound Blackwood along. Above them, the sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, but something was wrong with Blackwood's perfect ambush. Instead of disciplined, coordinated fire, from hidden positions, the shooting was scattered and confused. Maria realized that Nalnish must be up there in the rocks, moving among the hidden soldiers like a ghost, disrupting their planned attack. Red Cloud and his warriors, instead of being caught completely by surprise, had immediately taken cover, and were returning fire with the skill of men who had been fighting for their lives since childhood. These weren't helpless victims walking into a trap. They were experienced fighters who adapted quickly to unexpected situations. Joseph, Red Cloud's voice boomed across the canyon. Joseph, where are you? The response came from an unexpected direction, a small cave halfway up the canyon wall. Uncle, I'm here. Untrapped. Maria could see the 10-year-old boy now, waving frantically from the mouth of a cave that was barely large enough for a child. He had been tied up and left there like bait, just as they had suspected, but getting to him would mean climbing exposed rock walls while bullets flew in every direction. It seemed impossible until Maria saw movement above the cave. Nalnish, somehow having made his way to the top of the canyon wall, was lowering a rope toward his young relative. The rescue of Joseph became the turning point of the entire battle. As the Apache warriors saw their mission succeeding, they fought with renewed determination. As Blackwood soldiers saw their carefully planned ambush falling apart, some began to panic and retreat. More importantly, Private Morrison's description of the hidden soldiers had been accurate, and Marshal Hayes had not been idle during the night. Even as the battle raged in Devil's Canyon, federal reinforcements were surrounding the area. The sound of a cavalry charge echoed from the desert beyond the canyon entrance. Federal marshals! Hayes's voice boomed across the battlefield. Lay down your weapons! You are surrounded! That was the moment when Blackwood's conspiracy finally crumbled completely. Faced with federal troops, most of his soldiers chose surrender over certain death. The few who continued fighting were quickly overwhelmed by the combined force of Apache warriors and federal marshals working together. When the shooting finally stopped, Maria found herself sitting in the desert dust, hardly believing they had survived. Around her, federal marshals were taking prisoners while Apache warriors reunited with the rescued children. Nalnish appeared beside her, carrying young Joseph on his shoulders. The boy was thin and scared but unharmed. "It's over," the Apache warrior said simply, but Maria knew it wasn't really over. As Marshal Hayes explained while they rode back toward Fort Bowie, the Covenant of Progress had operations throughout the Western Territories. Blackwood's arrest would expose only part of a much larger conspiracy. However, the rescued Apache children would serve as living witnesses to the truth. Private Morrison and several other soldiers had agreed to testify about what they had been ordered to do. Most importantly, the false flag operations that had been designed to justify a new Apache war had been exposed before they could succeed, 3 months later. Maria stood on the porch of a new trading post built near Fort Bowie. It was smaller than her family's original store, but it served the same purpose, a place where different peoples could meet in peace and mutual respect. Nalnish had become something like a brother to her family. He often stopped by the trading post when he was in the area, sometimes bringing news from the reservation, sometimes just sharing a meal and conversation. The friendship that had been forged in crisis had grown into something lasting and meaningful. Federal investigations had led to arrests throughout the territory and even in Washington. The Covenant of Progress was broken, though Maria suspected that similar groups would always exist as long as there were people who valued profit over human dignity. But she had learned something important during those dangerous weeks in the desert. Evil might be powerful, but it wasn't invincible. When ordinary people chose courage over comfort, when they stood up for what was right regardless of the cost, they could change the world in ways that mattered. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind carried the scent of rain and the sound of children playing, Maria would remember the moment when she had tearfully whispered, "Help me ... quotes to an Apache warrior. And she would smile, knowing that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, and that real strength lies not in the weapons we carry, but in the choices we make when everything we believe in is at stake.